This meeting is being recorded.
Hello and welcome to a KCA Safety Committee monthly meeting. My name is John O'Brien from the Keystone Contractors Association. And on behalf of the Safety Committee, I know there's a few of you on the call. I saw Darren and Don and Tom. If any of you have any comments you want to add in now or during the presentation or afterwards, feel free to jump in. And thanks as always to Seth Core for organizing today's event. But you obviously didn't tune in to hear me talk. So just want to, on behalf of the Safety Committee, just say how excited we are to offer today's presentation. As you know, September is Construction Suicide Prevention Month. And we thought it would be a fitting presentation for that time. And Richard Jones from YouTurn Health, very knowledgeable, awesome speaker, just very entertaining. I think you're going to find it to be good stuff, very resourceful and informative. So Rich is going to take it away here, walk us through some slides, and I'll give the reins to you. However you want to handle questions is fine with us. We can do them during or after. It's totally up to you.
Yeah, I think we'll do it during. And should I just jump in?
Yeah. So if you have questions,
Okay.
just either put them in the chat or just start talking either way. So
yeah, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can throw them in the chat. I'll try to watch the chat as well. And if John, if you can try to watch it a little bit too. I'm going to go through some information on suicide prevention, but I want to do it a little bit different. This is one of those topics that we're finally talking a lot about in society, a lot of different industries, but it can also be one of the most boring topics if you don't do it right. It can just be a bunch of statistics and a bunch of warning signs. And I'm going to go through that and talk about that, but I'm going to also try to really incorporate it into a real life event. And I'm going to use the entertainment industry as an example. I'm going to talk about a suicide that occurred for one of my favorite bands. The name of the band is Linkin Park, and the name of the person who killed himself is Chester Bennington. And I'm going to talk about how there were all kinds of warning signs and nobody talked to this guy about it. And I'm going to use it as an example to try to encourage people to go ahead and bring up these issues with their coworkers and with their families and with their friends. Because if there's any one takeaway from today's presentation, it might sound so simple, but we talk about it. When in doubt, ask the person how they're doing, and then follow it up with like, no, really, how are you doing? That simple question will many times open the door for a person who's thinking about doing something to hurt themselves. It's and it's the single most important thing that anybody can convey to anyone else that wants to do something about suicide, is that the stigma and the taboo and the shame around this issue keeps us from talking about it and leads to some of these staggering numbers that we see. If you're okay with it, I'm going to leave the presentation in this format. If I go to a full slideshow, I can't see anybody and I can't see what's going on the screen in the meeting room. So we'll do it this way, unless you guys absolutely can't see the slides, and then let me know and I can make them larger. So this is who I am professionally. I'm a licensed therapist, a trauma therapist, all these different credentials that you have to get when you work in any field. You have to get badges in order to do the work. And I'm proud of this, and I'm glad I'm a therapist, and I'm glad I'm able to work in this field. And I've spent the majority of my career working in pretty traditional settings. But in addition to this, I'll share with everybody, right off the jump, and this is different for me. I was in the beginning of my career, you would never have heard me talking about my own issues. I'm also a person in recovery myself. So in my case, I'm in recovery from an opioid use disorder and an alcohol use disorder. And it was really pain pills that brought me to my knees. I was in a car accident in 1999. And, this is in Western PA, kind of like ground zero for the opioid epidemic. All the doctors are being told, don't let anybody feel pain, so on and so forth. I had a neck injury. Quite frankly, it wasn't that bad, but you guys know the rest of the story. That was my ticket to get whatever I wanted. I walked down to that emergency department that day with 190 Darvocet, which is unbelievable. And it just went downhill from there. Never bought a pill from the street, didn't even know how to, didn't know how to buy illicit drugs from the street. Nobody would have ever pegged me for an addict. Like if you'd have had an image in your mind of a person who's addicted, it would not be me. I was working for the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center at the time and Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic. I was like a recruiter, a trainer, stuff like that. Being promoted, not only like not getting in trouble at work, actually getting praised, but the whole time completely out of control, distraught, spending money on these prescriptions, just like, and my family knew what was going on, maybe a couple close friends. Nobody ever said anything though. And so I kind of went through that. Fortunately, finally intervention occurs and I was able to get into recovery. That's when I went back to school and became a therapist, and I've been working in the field ever since. I would also consider myself as a person in recovery from depression. And I still struggle with that from time to time. I know what it's like for me now. I know when it's coming for me, and I can prepare accordingly, and it doesn't hit me the way it used to. I'm a person who's had suicidal thoughts. I never had a plan, but I have had thoughts, and typically related to like stress, and typically related to something going on in my family, like especially if something happened to one of my kids, like a healthcare issue, and things would get kind of like out of control, I would start having those thoughts. And the reason why I want to say that right off the jump, you know, some people might be like, why is this guy telling us that? Isn't that embarrassing? Like, this is exactly what I want to challenge. That we have to understand, statistically speaking, 90% of Americans, I want you to think about this for a minute. 90% of Americans will report at some point of time in their life that they dealt with some type of emotional crisis or mental health issue. So if you are one of the folks who didn't have a mental health issue, you're actually the one who's a little bit abnormal, statistically speaking. And I think that messaging is important to get out there because, as I said at the beginning, the single biggest reason why we're seeing the increase in suicide and the increase in opioid overdose deaths and just death by alcohol, for example, the reason is because the stigma, and we don't talk about this. Nobody wants to be the guy, you know, who has to raise his hand and go see the EAP counselor. Nobody wants to be the guy who has to go and see the therapist and who's too weak, guy or girl who's too weak to handle life, right? That's how we think about it. And so we want to confront that directly and throw that out the window. I'm currently the chief clinical officer and the founder of an organization called YouTurn Health. YouTurn Health is a coaching organization. We're a supplement to EAP. We do non-clinical level of care. So picture people who've been through this before helping other people who need help. So someone who's been through addiction, for example, becomes a recovery coach and then helps the next person. They're professionally trained and supervised by myself and my team of clinicians. So it's a professional service, but it's founded more on lived experience than on academic credentials. And then we also maintain the country's largest library of mental health and substance use disorder videos, about 475 videos at this point on topics that proprietary topics that we did ourselves, either myself or other therapists or real life people in recovery. We've about 475 videos on topics from anxiety to grief to trauma, so on and so forth. And I'll talk more about that at the end. But let's jump into this. This is the essence of everything that I believe about therapy, about being a friend, about being a coworker. Nobody really cares what my degree is in. Nobody really cares how much I know. I mean, I get sometimes parents and family members will want to know what my background is. What people want to know is, do I have compassion? Do I care about my fellow human beings? Do I care enough to ask? Do I care enough to go the extra mile if I'm working with you? Do I care enough? And am I doing this job from a place of mission, like a mission oriented, rather than just like a job? And so this is the air we breathe. And I believe that attitude right there, nobody cares how much you know unless they know how much you care, that can be embraced by any company, anywhere, and that there are actually techniques and things that people can do to even enhance that. So at YouTurn, that's the essence of what we're all about. And I know a lot of folks on this safety committee are like that. I know I've met a lot of folks in the construction industry on my journey. And that's the vibe I get from you folks as well, that this is enough. We've had enough of this. We've had enough of our friends killing themselves. I've had enough of young people dying of overdoses. You know, it's time for a change. And the change starts with crushing the stigma and being okay with talking about this stuff. I did want to say this right off the jump, make sure everybody's aware. There is now nationally a new suicide hotline. It's meant to mimic 911. It's called 988. Now there've been some bumps in the road with the rollout. It's working pretty well overall, but it's not working. Some communities we're having some struggles with it. It depends on the local resources in any given community. But that number is now active. If you have anybody that you're worried about, or you need to pass the information on, they hit 988 and they will get somebody that can help them, just like 911 for the police or for ambulance services. And again, guys, if anybody has any questions, please throw them in the chat, or better yet, take yourself off mute and interrupt me, and let's go ahead and talk about it. So I wanted to make sure I said that at the beginning. I'll talk to you about the YouTurn Health crisis prevention model and some of the resources. You know, we don't reinvent the wheel. We use some of the stuff that's out there, like QPR. QPR stands for question, persuade, and respond. Mental health first aid is another good example. The federal government has a thing called TIP 42, Comprehensive Crisis Management, and the Center for Disease Control has a lot of good resources if you're looking for additional information. And then, of course, the construction industry in and of itself has a lot of good information. Our model, we really emphasize on intervening upstream, and we emphasize staying with the person. We don't believe that crisis prevention and suicide prevention is a single event. It's what happens before the crisis and what happens after the crisis that will prevent further crisis. Your response during the crisis is pretty standard. As far as like how you handle somebody who's actively suicidal, that's pretty straightforward. Depending on the level, you're going to activate emergency services, and I'm going to talk about that. That's not the tricky part. The tricky part is most of the time when one of these crises occurs, all that happens is it gets stabilized and then there's no follow-up. And so the question is, what could have been going on beforehand and what could be going on after the event in order to address these issues in a more comprehensive way? So we're going to talk about that. We'll learn the basics of suicide prevention. We're going to talk about risk factors. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the myths that are out there, and then a little bit on debriefing following a completed suicide and the fallout and impact on staff. I mean, I've seen staggering statistics in this area. Some people talk about over 100 people are directly impacted when another person takes their life. In other words, like when you start to look at the ripple effect among the family, among the friends, among the extended family, so on and so forth. So it's not simple. So a crisis, just the simplest definition, an intense time, difficulty, trouble, or danger. And what we really should add to this, where an answer is not immediately where an answer is not readily available. A crisis tends to involve a situation where the person going through it, or the family member or the coworker, they don't know exactly what to do, which makes the event itself even more threatening, even more problematic. And a crisis is different for different people. What's a crisis for Rich Jones is not the same as it would be for John. It depends on your background. It depends on your own experience with things. Have you ever been through anything like this before? So the individual themselves define the crisis. And if you look at this graphic, this is where we run into the trouble. So if you look at what we got, what that green line indicates is our emotional, what's called our emotional arousal in psychological terms. When we enter into a crisis, our level of anger, our level of frustration, our level of fear, our level of anxiety, our level of worry, all those things, they escalate quickly and they climb the ladder. And you can see at the top of the crisis cycle what it's like. You literally get tunnel vision when you're in the middle of a crisis. You get tunnel vision. You can't hear and see outside of what's going on right in front of you. Your ability to utilize what's called abstract reasoning goes away. So if there was something going on and one of your coworkers or somebody found themselves in a crisis, it's very hard to talk them out of it from a logical point of view, because you lose the ability to do that. You lose the ability to think clearly. You can't sit down and write down a pros and cons list. Literally, your brain, that part of your brain has been taken offline, and all your energy is just on the survival, what you got to do in the moment. And here's what's interesting. We're pretty good at this part of it. At the top of the crisis cycle, we know how to respond. This is where we're calling emergency services, or we're calling in if we have on-site supports. We're getting the person separated. We're providing unconditional positive regard. In other words, we're just listening, letting them work through it. But then look beforehand. When the escalation was occurring, is there anything we could have done to recognize this? And I put some examples down there. Maybe the person was sober for a while and they relapsed. Can you see the escalation of the use? Can you see how dangerous it is and try to catch it beforehand? And then can we debrief it on the back end? And again, this is a lot of times, guys, where professional services come in. This is what we do. For example, at YouTurn, and this is what I do as a therapist, and I was an EAP provider for a long time. We talk through that stuff. We don't just talk about what happened at the top of the pyramid there. We talk about what happened beforehand and what happened afterward, because the goal is for the person to be safe moving forward. And then the other part of this is you can learn a lot about how to prevent it from happening to other people as well. So I'll pause there for a second. Any questions or comments about the crisis cycle? I'll just pause. Take yourself off mute if you want to add anything. Going once, going twice. All right. So you cannot do a suicide prevention course without throwing out some statistics, but I'm not going to go deep into this. It's worse than it's ever been, would be the easiest and the best way to say this. 46,000, I think it's closer to 47,000. That number is a little bit old. That's 2 years old. 1.3 million attempts. This next statistic is very, very troubling. 1 in 3 adolescents report suicidal ideation. That's staggering. I want you to do a thought experiment. Think back when you were in high school. How many people did you know that overdosed on drugs and died or killed themselves? I knew one person. Compare that to the senior class at the local high school here, where I am. The senior class here, if you're a senior in that class, you know 13 people who have either overdosed and died or committed suicide. It's almost like mind-blowing to me as a therapist working that we've gotten to this point and we've allowed it to progress that far. It was only 20 years ago when I got into recovery, there were only 9,000 deaths. And it's not all because of Purdue Pharma, guys. And it's not all because of fentanyl. It's because we have a fundamentally flawed response to this. And we have a response that currently allows the stigma to kick our ass, because a person has to raise their hand, go sign up for services. It's got to be this diagnostic process where you get labeled. We don't believe in any of that. We believe that it can start with one human being talking to another human being. But we are where we are, and it's desperate times. Again, 115 people are exposed and impacted. That's the statistic I was looking for. Recent research suggests that for each death by suicide, 115 people are exposed and impacted. 25 of those people will experience a major life disruption, meaning they'll go into depression themselves. They'll develop a substance use issue as the fallout. And if you've ever known anybody who's going through this, you know what that's all about. And it's not judging them. It's almost unavoidable in many, many cases. Suicide risk is greater than people in survivors, and risk is actually highest in middle-aged adults. My age group and my demographic actually are the highest white middle-aged guys. A lot of different theories out there on why that is. Just the idea, like the pressure of the perceived pressure of being a provider, Kid issues become different as kids get older. I don't know if you ever heard the phrase like little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. That kind of feeds into it. Financial difficulties tend to really start to hit home in middle age. And then, of course, untreated depression. I've spent my whole life just dealing with this. Well, it starts to get the best of you as you get to middle age. Substance use is frequently involved. In my opinion, it's hard to address one without the other. SAMHSA says 80% of people who commit a suicide suffer from either suffer from a mental health problem, and then also up to 50% suffer from some kind of substance use disorder. It's a lethal combination. So let's talk about the myths and how we can start to break through this and be okay. The supreme myth that's out there is that only certain people can prevent suicide. You got to talk to a therapist. You got to talk to a professional. It's got to be a psychologist. Now, we believe that people should be trained, and there are things that you can do to make the process smoother, to make it easier for the person to help. But the facts are, we are all part of this solution. It is all hands on deck time. And anybody can help another person who's going through this. It's just a willingness to say, are you okay? No, are you really okay? Or some version of that. And then this training can also help you understand where to go with that if you get a positive response from the person or an affirmative response. So that's the supreme myth. Here are some other myths that keep people from asking. One of the ones that I hear a lot, when I'm on site and I'm doing different things, people think if you ask another person about thoughts of suicide, that it increases the likelihood. That's a false. That is false. Actually, most people who are thinking about suicide want somebody to ask. They're just waiting for somebody to ask. Of course, there are some folks who progress to this point where they're really keeping it under the lid and they're not saying anything. But even in those cases, we believe that if you ask the question, most people want a way out. Here's what happens when a person commits suicide, guys. The pain of staying alive outweighs the perceived pain of being dead. It's that simple. Life gets so miserable, either maybe it's because of a mental health problem, maybe it's because of a situational circumstance that drives the person, but it becomes a permanent solution to a temporary problem. It becomes a bad solution, a bad permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so the facts are, talking about suicide reduces it rather than increases it. Myth number 2, people who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. You don't hear this as much. I really do think that we've come a long way. This used to be thrown around a lot. It's not about attention. There is a mental health condition called bipolar disorder, and those folks engage in what's called parasuicidal behavior. They will cut themselves sometimes, or they'll take pills, but they're not doing it to kill themselves. They are, in those cases, it is about attention and what's called secondary gain, but that's not suicidal intent. That's a whole nother mental health issue. Folks who are talking about suicide are in desperate condition. Myth number 3, suicide can't be prevented. We've kind of already talked about that. It's preventable, but it's unpredictable. Most people who contemplate suicide are in intense emotional pain, hopelessness. The cognitive triad is what it's called in psychology, and it goes like this: I suck, the world sucks, and it always will. When people start thinking that way, that's the dangerous thought pattern, especially the third part of that triad, the it always will part, the hopelessness part. I suck, the world sucks, and there's no way it's ever going to be different. That last part, there's no way it's going to be different. That's the one that gets people, which is why talking about it can be so helpful, because even if you're able to put in any kind of hope for a different future, that many times can get the person to seek help. So that's myth number 3. Myth number 4, people who take their own lives are selfish, cowards, or weak. People who take their own lives are intense intensely in pain. I remember the last one that I was like privy to, or however you want to say it. This is a young man that I worked with for a long time. He had stabilized. He had actually gotten discharged from my practice, and it had gotten to a point where his mom was working for me in a nonprofit, and he was doing very, very well. And I'll never forget the night that he took his own life. It was only her and I in the building when she got the news. And I remember her crying and talking and saying, like, he was in such pain. He was in such pain. That was probably the time when I really got in touch with really what this is like for the folks who act on it. It's not cowardice. It's not weak. Depression and suicide is not a matter of like, I'm stronger than you or you're weaker than me. It is a neurobiological, neurochemical issue. It is a psychological or thinking issue. Many times there's a physical component to it. You'll hear people talk about being in such pain that it contributes to it, like literally physical pain. One of the most interesting side notes about the opioid epidemic, guys, is how effective opioids are at relieving psychological pain in addition to physical pain. We think the opioid epidemic was all about people getting hurt and getting put on oxys and stuff like that. That was part of it, but really, like, I'll speak for myself, I got incredible emotional relief. It was probably the first antidepressant I ever took. And you can see if a person gets a hold of that stuff and for the first time they have some relief, you can see why they would keep going back for more. Teenagers and college students this is a myth. Teenagers and college students are the most at risk. We already talked about this. It's 45 through 64. Nothing can be done once a person decides to commit to suicide. Like, in other words, if I made up my mind, there's nothing you can do about it. That's also false. There are far-ranging interventions that can prevent suicide. Sometimes talking to the person in and of itself, but things like safety plans are very effective. Barriers to lethal means are incredibly effective. One of the things, so I was working at Western Psych, and this was one of my first experiences with like a actual like suicide intervention. I was running their mobile crisis team, and we got a call, and the person was going to kill himself. But what he agreed to do was to give up his guns, get his guns out of his house. Now, we had to go to like some lengths to get this. And this is where it is helpful to get a professional involved, because we can get the police involved and things like this. And the person can do it. You can do it in a way where the person doesn't get arrested and things like that. But that was the step that we took. And we took him to the psych hospital, got him evaluated and everything like that. But he was able to return home. And honestly, without the guns being in the house, his mind didn't go anywhere else. He didn't think of any other way to do it. It was actually fascinating. It was almost as if it was too much trouble for him to think of another way to do it. Here's what I've come to understand about that process, guys. When you start going down that trail of suicidal thinking and so on and so forth, it takes up a lot of emotional energy, and you actually do start planning it. And then whenever the lethal means are taken away, it's almost like you're like, screw it. So absolutely, this is a myth. We can absolutely do something, and we can save lives. This is a myth. This is myth number 7, not myth number 8. Talk therapy and medications don't work. Talk therapy and medications work very well. Believe it or not, there are things like coaching that work very well. There's a whole series of that we call positive psychology that has been shown to reduce suicide risk. And these are just daily actions that a person can take. So even beyond talk therapy and medications, there are other interventions that can be used along the way. And then you got myth number 8, which will lead us to our case study. This is, see, I had these two mixed up, my bad. This is where people really get it wrong. You'll hear people say this like on the news and stuff. No one saw this coming. Nobody actually like even thought for a minute that this would happen. That's actually false. There are typically a lot of warning signs associated with suicide. Some of them are very, very obvious. Most of them are subtle. I'm just going to run through a few of them. Of course, talking about it, making statements. I'm going to kill myself. I wish I were dead. Even if they sound like they're off the cuff statements. dude, I wish I wouldn't even have woke up today. Follow it up with a question like, what do you mean? Tell me about that. Getting the means to take your own life, buying a gun, stockpiling pills, withdrawing from social contact, always wanting to be left alone, intense mood swings, an odd kind of noticeable preoccupation with death, dying, or violence. We talked about hopelessness already. An increase in the use of alcohol or drugs can signal a problem. Changing your normal routine. Like if you see people who wind up eating much more or sleeping much more than they used to, or eating much less or sleeping much less than they used to, that can be an example. Risky, self-destructive things. And then this one right here, this is the one, guys, in my opinion. It's been there every single time I've ever been involved in any kind of suicide situation. The person, I call it, they go on their farewell tour. They start giving away stuff. They also start talking to people that they haven't talked to for a while. They call their long lost aunt just to see how she's doing. You know, they give away their belongings to their friends and nobody can really understand why. That's because they're preparing to kill themselves. This is one where the person has progressed a little bit further. And this part here, saying goodbye to people as if they won't be seen again. And you'll hear people afterwards say, I found that odd. I found it odd that he called me. Well, we want to get the word out so much that every single person on the planet understands this stuff, so that whenever somebody calls their great Aunt Sally and starts saying this stuff, that Aunt Sally calls 988 and does something about it. And then developing personality changes, another sign or symptom. Let's pause there and see if we have any questions, either in the chat or take yourself off mute. Give us a second here.
I do have a
Once,
comment more than a question.
going twice. There we go. Somebody's got something.
You hear me?
Yep,
Hey, Rich.
I got you.
So one thing that I ran into just recently is that someone that was going through a crisis for a long time.
Yep.
He actually reached out in the past to friends and they did their best to help. And the way they did that was to drive them to the ER, drive this person to the ER. And the ER did absolutely nothing for this person, made them wait because they're dealing with people that are actually dying. And then when he left, nothing was happening for hours, and he left, and he ended up going back home without any help. And then he ended up with a $1,500 emergency bill, which didn't help his situation. It made it worse.
Oh my gosh.
So I think that's one thing I just wanted to mention I learned. And someone was really honestly trying to help him and made it worse.
That is such a great example, Seth. And I'll tell you, like, that's the part of the equation that we have so much trouble controlling. We can't control the system. We can't control the response of the system. But I don't know if you guys can hear that story, but that, like, basically the guy winds up going to where he's supposed to get help, and then it winds up being useless. And so the next time he's going through that, you know, is anybody going to say anything at all, or is he even going to listen if anybody does? He's
having a hard time working too, as well, Rich. He's having a hard time working, so he's not making a lot of money. Now he has a bill, medical bill, on top of what he's dealing with. So,
oh my gosh. So this is where we think we also got to think outside the box. And I'm not in any kind of way trying to turn this into a U-turn commercial, but this is why we do coaching instead of like clinical work. Because what we have found is that it's a long-term solution, not a short-term, let's get him to the ER solution. So we would get that guy to the ER for sure, because it sounds like it was very serious. But what we would want to do is have a professional coach involved on the long-term, somebody that can reach out to that person, even if that person's not calling. So I'll give you an example. Like, I have a caseload of probably like 8 or 10 people. And if I don't hear from them every Monday, I call them or text them. Like, it's automatic. And so what we find is the proactive approach can sometimes help work through some of these things, like the fallout around the bill, for example, and the fact that this guy would never want to call again. Somebody needs to be stepping in because the system doesn't know how to step in. I mean, guys, I'm sorry to say that. And in certain environments, when I say that, I'll be like, people will get upset with me. I can't tell you how far off we are in the way that we help people. Like, we think that somebody's going to raise their hand and come into the office and talk through these issues and get put on medication and be okay. That is not that is only part of the solution. It's a lifestyle issue. It's an ongoing problem. And so having somebody attached that you can kind of like go to for the long term has got to become part of the solution. Now, fortunately, the construction industry, you guys know that because you're working on your own peer models that I've heard of. It's kind of like the world is starting to move that direction. I just wish we'd get there a little faster. But Seth, that is a great example. And what you're doing there is you got to work through, you know, all the issues that are outside of our control, everything that the person has experienced. A little bit more on just some background issues. This is very hard to see, but this just sort of captures other risk factors beyond things that the person would say. It's things like gender, for example, males complete suicide at a higher rate, pre-existing mental illness. I will send this PowerPoint to John, and he can distribute it, and you guys can have it for a reference. This is just good. You just keep it. It's just a real good way of kind of conceptualizing what other issues. So you might find out that somebody, like it says here, bereavement and significant loss. If a spouse has passed away, for example, that's somebody you want to pay closer attention to. Financial stress is huge, just huge. People will get to a point with finances where they really can't see any other way out. Homelessness, stuff like that, isolation, we've talked through a lot of that as well. And again, this is just all the same stuff, just packaged a little bit different. And then I did want to also put this in here. There are certain mental health disorders or certain issues that tend to be higher association. Bipolar disorder is the highest, major depression, not surprisingly, right behind it. So if you have somebody that works for you, or you know somebody who's dealt with that, that puts them at a little bit of a higher level. The one that says dysthymia, 8.6%. Dysthymia is actually now called persistent depressive disorder. What it means, guys, major depression, you can think of that as the heavy hitter. That's the one that you can't get out of bed. That's the one where you stop eating. Where, you know, like that's like the most serious manifestation of depression. But it tends to come and go. Major depression tends to come and go. Winston Churchill famously had major depression, and he would call it the black dog, is what he called it, because it wasn't there all the time. Whereas dysthymia is there all the time. But it's not as intense. Again, a little bit more groups at risk. All right, so that's the information, and I want to show you an example from the entertainment industry where this played out. And this could happen in any workplace, anywhere, anytime. It's happening all day, every day. The folks, like people in hindsight noticed that something was up, but in the moment nobody could detect it. So, and we'll talk about what gets in the way of that. So this is Chester Bennington. If you know anything about, I guess the genre would be alternative rock. Linkin Park was a very popular band. They like a lot of hit songs in the 80s and 90s. This is actually this is a screenshot of a YouTube video of Chester Bennington 36 hours before he killed himself. He was doing a internet challenge. There was this internet challenge called the Cinnamon Challenge or something like that. I don't even know what you have to do in it, but basically it was just one of those things that people would record and they would upload. And if you look at that picture, if you watch the whole video, because his wife left the video up on YouTube as, in her words, a public service announcement that like people look okay, they may not be okay. It's him and his two like preteen sons doing this challenge together. And just look at the picture of him. Look how happy he looks. Nobody would think that Chester Bennington was planning to hang himself. That's what was going on in that picture. And, you know, you talk to some people that were around him and you start to hear, this is another band, Limp Bizkit. They were the same genre. Fred Durst, best friends with Bennington. He writes that like, you could see that people knew something was up. Often those types of people have so much pain and torture inside that the last thing they want is to contaminate or break the spirit of others. So they go out of their way to be fun. They go out of their way. it doesn't look like a depressed person like you see it on TV. Jay-Z weighs in on it. Jay-Z is a famous rapper. Hopefully his death serves as a wake-up call. Look what he says in the red. You just start numbing yourself. You just become numb. He was singing about it. He literally had a song called Numb. You just go and you get bigger audiences and it looks like everything's going great. Now you could make that equivalent to somebody in any job. You know, you get promoted, you're doing great. It seems like everything's fine. Do you really know what's going on behind closed doors with anyone? His wife, Talinda, she literally said, I thought he was in a good place. No idea. He's a bright, loving soul with an angel's voice. He had a history of drug and alcohol issues. He had a history of severe depression. But again, everybody thought he was okay. These are the lyrics from his song, his hit song called Numb. A lot of people think this hook, this line right here, caught in the undertow, just caught in the undertow, was a reference to that feeling of when you're depressed. And again, he's right. But an even more intense song that came out before his death was this one. It was called What I've Done. To cross out what I've become, erase myself. So it's almost like this guy's writing a suicide note in some of his lyrics, but nobody's really saying anything because on the surface, he's looking like life is a party. Life is great. We go on a little bit further. There were warning signs. This is what Talinda said to CNN when they did an interview with her. I'm now more educated about those signs. They were definitely there. The hopelessness, the change of behavior, the isolation. We avoid these conversations because they're so hard. And we also feel like we're getting into people's business. Family, friends, coworkers. Almost inevitably, when somebody takes their own life, in hindsight, there were signs. And that's what I want to get us in touch with, is that we will see these things if we're looking for them. And it's okay to ask the question. It's better to ask the question and have the person mad at you than to not say anything at all and then have the worst outcome. A little bit more on Bennington. He had a history of drug and alcohol use. I went through that. You may or may not know about employees that intimately, whether or not they've ever been in recovery, but somebody who's been in and out of recovery is certainly something that we need to pay attention to. Nobody knows whether he had relapsed prior to the suicide, and nobody has really pressed it or pushed it because it just would be bad taste. But a relapse could have been going on here. He was definitely isolating himself and expressing hopelessness, and he had a change of behavior. But this next slide is the one where where we could have done a better job. If you know Stone Temple Pilots and Chris Cornell, right? They were best friends.
Soundgarden.
Bennington kills himself in September, I think. Cornell kills himself in May. This, a lot of people think, was the straw that broke the camel's back, and actually when he started planning his own suicide. So if you know, this goes back to the point of, do you know anybody who suffered a loss? It doesn't even have to be suicide. If it's suicide, it makes it more likely. And I don't know, I mean, I'm sure some of you guys were fans of Stone Temple Pilots. I'm sure some of you guys know who Linkin Park is. I mean, these were like superstars. These were not marginally successful people. They were superstars. Does somebody have a question?
I
thought I
do.
saw somebody.
Yeah, it's John.
Okay.
It's funny you bring up, and it's Soundgarden actually, not Stone Temple Pilots.
Oh, it's Soundgarden. My bad.
Yeah. No, but the story you were talking about, Benninghoff or Chester Benningfield, the whole time you were talking, I just pictured Chris Cornell because I'm a Soundgarden fan. I think they're one of the best bands. But he had that same history, and the day before he died and the day he died, he was talking to his wife. He was at a tour somewhere, and his wife said he's at this great place. He's turned the corner. He's been depressed all these years, and then the next day she gets a call, and it's just the roller coaster.
Unbelievable. Yep.
She thought everything was fine.
And And guys, we don't work in jobs where we're on a tour, and we don't work but how does it show up in your workplace? How does it look for your people? It's not going to be, I cannot believe that I said Chris Cornell was part of Stone Temple Pilots. I'm so sorry, John. It's
It's all good.
Soundgarden, absolutely Soundgarden. Yeah, so nobody yeah. No, I'm kind of mad at myself for that. And so basically, what's our version of Chris Cornell being on tour, if that makes sense? How would it look in your industry? The guy who's on top of the world, that kind of thing. What are the signs, symptoms, and ways that you can help? And a lot of it comes down to this. The biggest barrier to suicide prevention is stigma. Shame and discomfort surrounding the topic. It is a squirrely topic. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but it's the least favorite topic of even psychologists and therapists whenever you survey folks. Whenever I was working at Western Psych, they were called secret shoppers. I was running the mobile crisis line, so we had to deal with suicide all the time. And so these consultants would call us and pretend that they were suicidal to see how we responded. And they would really put us through a lot of training. So I got to the point where I became completely comfortable with it. But I'm going to tell you, early on, I can relate. It was very much the topic that nobody really wanted to go to. And mainly, these are some of the reasons. The main reason is, what if I make it worse? What if I don't know what to do? That kind of thing. And the story earlier that Seth shared kind of falls into that category. But here's what I would say is, those folks that took him to the ER, they did the right thing. It was the ER, and it was our system that is insufficient. So we need to tell ourselves, we're not going to make this worse. Other things that can get in the way, your own beliefs, your own values, your own opinions. We got to respect people's differences. We got to try to be non-judgmental. If you've known anybody who committed suicide, that could make it more likely that you ask. It could also make it less likely you ask, but it's definitely going to impact you. And then, of course, attitude and outlook surrounding mental health in general. So what are the do's and the don'ts? Do remove opportunities. This is preventing lethal means. And do you have, what were you going to do? You're going to take pills, kind of stuff. Receive and accept suicidal community. Intrude, get up in people's business in this. Prevent isolation. Transfer rather than refer. What that means, and again, this speaks to Seth's story. They did the right thing. They would tell you, actually get the guy in the car and take him to the ER. Don't just send him to the ER. Follow up. This is calling the person the next day. And again, many times professional services are involved in this part of it. And we talked about your own value system. You can also look for any kind of identifying issues or triggers. And then you use yourself as an instrument of prevention. And what that means is the relationship. Don't worry about saying the wrong thing. Don't consider suicidal people as special needs people or anything. It's just a state of mind at the current time. Do not assume that you can solve the problem alone. Now, this is an interesting one. Do not try to talk the person out of committing suicide. You could talk, a lot of times we'll talk, especially professionals will talk about safety plans and things like that. That's getting a commitment that the person will contact you the next day, but don't say things like, come on, you got a lot to look forward to. It's not that bad. That actually invalidates the person's experience. Don't get too abstract about it. People will sometimes try things like, what do you think happens when you die? People don't really want to hear that when they're in that state of mind. You also don't want to be the opposite of it and make it light. This is something that I'm worried about in our society with young people. I don't know, you'll see somebody commit suicide and then you'll get on Facebook and it'll be shout out, bro, fly free, bro. You'll see it a lot with rappers and stuff and I'm I call it the shout out bro culture. I don't like it. It takes away the seriousness of it. I understand what they're doing, man, but it's not a shout out bro situation. It's serious. John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I have a comment there, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yep.
So last year I coached youth football, and right after the last game, a 13-year-old player committed suicide. And the family wanted to have a celebration of life, which was nice, but then afterwards, it's like it gravitated towards, they started a foundation in his name, and they have, and I keep biting my tongue. I'm like, you keep celebrating his name and everything. And I'm like, is that
Yeah,
really the path we should be going down? Is that really something we should be
it's a
celebrating?
great question.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I think it's the way it's done. I know what's going on for that family there. That's probably the only way they can bear it, right? Like making meaning out of a tragedy. And I know a foundation where they did that in the son's name, but the way that they approach it, it's not glorified. You know what I mean? It's not like that at all. You know what I mean? It's very
Yeah.
much about education. They just let the son's name kind of be the name of the foundation, but they don't tell a lot of stories about him. They focus more on prevention and educating other youth, and it's just in their son's name. I think it could become problematic if and I don't know, I think this is an area that a lot of us don't know how to react to yet, John, to be honest with you. Like a lot of therapists, a lot of people that work in this field, because young people were never killing themselves like this. And there was no such thing as social media. And you didn't, like, some people would say, Rich, it's good that people are doing it. My take on it is that you got to be careful. We know for sure there are things like copycat suicides, and we know that it can come in waves. So that's where I would say we want to be mindful of it. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to the foundation thing, John.
Yeah.
I think the way that the foundation is promoted and how they handle it has everything to do with that. And then a little bit more, this is a cool little acronym that I use, like for do's and don'ts. Ask, care, escort. It's okay to ask if they're thinking about it. If you ask, you want to actively listen, acknowledge their feelings, don't debate it. It's all this stuff we said, but it's kind of broken up into these categories. And again, I'll send this to John. Listen to the person. This thing, don't encourage him to do it as a test. I can't even believe it made the list. Like people, I'm taking that off. I officially do not approve of this anymore. This was not I didn't make up this ACE model right here, but I'm not using that one. Don't act shocked at their desire to die. Like that's the whole, like, oh goodness, you have everything going for you. And then the escort part is the get them to the emergency room, so on and so forth. I borrowed this from the military. Because as you can imagine, we do a lot of work in the military, but as you can imagine, that's an area that's very much focused on suicide prevention. I was part of what's called the Governor's Task Force, focused on reducing veteran suicide. So that's where this model came from. And then again, I'll say this one more time. No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Listen to learn rather than listen to respond. And I'll tell you a story real quick that illustrates that. So this is like in 2001, 2002. I'm a rookie working for UPMC and Western Psych. I don't know what the hell I'm doing on any given day of the week, and we're working with these folks, and we're doing the best we can. And this lady stepped in front of a bus. At least we thought she stepped in front of a bus, and she got hit by a bus and she wound up going home, and I wound up getting a call about it. So she's in her apartment. She had schizophrenia. She had bipolar disorder. She had crack cocaine addiction. She was probably in her early 60s, and she was at the house. And what was going on is she was refusing to go to the hospital. Now, everybody involved with this situation had formulated their own story about it before we even talked to the lady. Like literally, oh my gosh, I'll change her name. Mary stepped in front of a bus and tried to commit suicide again. That's what we were telling ourselves as we go to their house. And it was Christmas Eve when I went there. It was myself and only one other guy. Everybody else had already left the building. So we go over to this person's house, and there's blood everywhere, and she's refusing to go to the hospital. And it's basically like people were yelling at her, like, you're going to go one way or the other. You try to commit suicide. And I remember, like, for whatever reason, like at that point in time, my training like kicked in, and this idea of being curious and being open and being a human being kicked in. I was no longer Mr. Therapist guy. I was just a dude who was trying to help. And I started asking her questions like, you've been doing so good, Mary. Like, what's going on? What exactly is going on that you tried to kill yourself? Like, what's going on here? Why don't you want to go to the hospital? And she would just like, she didn't really talk about it. And then when I got her alone, she told me the story, and it was unbelievable. This changed my life in terms of how I do my work. She explained to me how when she first was diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and crack cocaine addiction, she had all these issues. So her kids were naturally taken away from her. We didn't even know she had kids. Nobody had ever taken the time to really, because all we ever dealt with were crises. So I was like, oh, wow. And then she said that they both had been adopted into the foster system. And there was a boy and a girl, and the boy had struggled and been in and out of jail, but the girl had got adopted by a really good family and had gone to med school and had become a doctor. Okay, wow, didn't know that. And then she goes on and she says, and she's coming to see me for Christmas for the first time ever. This is what she says. And I was in too much of a hurry when I stepped in front of that bus. I didn't, and I'm not going to go to the hospital because I haven't seen my daughter. She finally agreed to come see me. And you could imagine how I felt when she said that. And you could, and immediately I go out and I said, listen, we're not doing this. Like, this is what's going on. I went back to her. I said, I tell you what we're going to do. If you go to the hospital, I will go get your daughter at the airport. I'll bring her to the hospital and we will be there with you and you'll still get to see her. And she went immediately. Now the point of this story isn't that you're going to be in situations like this. The point of the story is when we get into a crisis, it goes back to this idea of like, how do we prevent it from happening again? If we're really able to meet the person and be curious about what they got going on and be present with them, sometimes we're going to find something out that we didn't know. And many times when we find that out, it can make all the difference in the world. So guys, that is exactly 3 o'clock, and I am going to respect your time. Anybody have any final questions? I hope this did the job. Thank you for having me. Anybody have anything they want to share or any final questions?
I do. I don't mean to interrupt anybody. I'm Howard Bernstein with Penn Installations. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. And I appreciate the rock references. And
Oh, you got a guitar back there. Yes, you do.
oh, sorry, I don't know.
It's all right.
I looked at my background, but I think about you had used rock references, Chris Cornell, whom I love.
Yeah.
Chester Bennington and their connection. And these are people who had an outlet. These are people who had the ability to write songs, to perform, to somehow express whatever they're feeling. People in our world don't have that.
No.
And I don't think day to day they have that ability to get that rage, that anger, that disenchantment.
Right.
And the interesting thing, John brought up Alice in Chains. I believe Lane Staley, the lead singer there, I don't think he committed suicide necessarily, but had substance issues.
Yeah.
And but my point being, in the context of those examples that you guys used, those people had opportunities to express their issues every day. People in our world do not.
So that's a great observation. What I wonder is, as we learn more about this and we dig more and we really, really devote ourselves to preventing suicide, maybe we can start to see things that we didn't see before. Maybe it is being expressed. It's not being expressed as obvious as Chester Bennington writing a lyric that says "erase myself," right? That's pretty darn straightforward. But are there other signs? Are there other ways? Are they acting it out in other kind of avenues? That would be the challenge. But I totally agree with your observation. I 100%. Who else? I thought somebody else might have had a comment or a thought. And if not, that's fine, guys.
I do have one. It's sort of based again on the when people go to the ER, the ER's, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is what I'm trying to figure out. The ER is made for after the person tried to commit suicide with pills, and then they pay attention to you. But then if you're going there because you feel like you're doing it, that story kind of reminded me that maybe that particular ER wasn't prepared for that, or if all of them are like that. But the reason I brought that
Yeah,
back
it's a great question, Seth.
because
Here's what
like,
happens when you go to the, yeah. Here's what happens when you go ahead, I'm sorry.
before you explain that, I do want to say they treat alcoholics a lot differently and a lot better in my mind, because you go
Yeah.
to a rehab, they take you right there and then,
Yep.
and then they don't let you go, and they get you mental health too, because a lot of times addiction is because of mental issues. And is there something like that for suicide where they take you right away?
Yeah.
In like if you're an alcoholic.
You know, it's a great question. There really isn't. There are residential mental health facilities, but they're cost prohibitive and they're very few and far between. The closest you can get is like a psych hospital. What happens when the person gets to the ER's responsibility is they have to talk to the person and then at least have like a psychiatric evaluation. But if the person says, I'm good to go, nah, my friends made me come, I really don't want to, then they're going to release him. Like they can only go on what the person says. So a lot of times when the person gets to the emergency room, they don't want to go in, they get cold feet, you know what I mean? They just simply say, no, I really don't want to do that. And then they get sent home. So
yeah,
that's what's
or
happening.
they don't want to wait because they're dealing with
Yep.
people that took the pills already. And
That's right.
working on those guys instead of the person that says they want to do it. It's more, to me, I don't know which one's
That's
more
right.
important to deal with
This
first.
is where like the work that goes on after the incident or before the incident, and can the person be in some type of ongoing relationship, like whether it's therapy, whether it's psychiatric services. In our case, we do coaching services, anything that, because you're capturing the essence of the problem. You can even resolve the issue and not really resolve the issue. And that's a hard thing to ask people to do. You know what I mean? It's not like you taking me to the hospital because I broke my leg, right? You get me in the car, you take me to the hospital, you get me there, they fix my leg. We all feel good. Thank you, Seth, for helping me. That's not how it works with this issue, right? It seems like it's always unresolved. That's why long-term relationships are so important.
Wait, so you're saying it might be almost better to try to convince a person to go to a psych ward more so than the ER if
Yep.
you can get that done, right?
I think so.
Look, I think that might be better.
Especially if you have, in some cities, you'll have like a psychiatric emergency room. So for example, in Pittsburgh, it's called the DEC, Diagnostic Evaluation Center. It's at Western Psych. Are you in Pittsburgh, Seth?
I'm in Harrisburg. What's in Harrisburg?
You know?
And
And so we'd have to look around in Harrisburg, but some cities do have psychiatric emergency rooms. And if you take them there, totally different experience, because that's what but if you take them to a regular emergency department, you don't know what you're going to get. You really don't. And you could get a really good experience, or you could get a really
that's good to know.
bad experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's good to know.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you for having me, guys. I'm going to jump now. Please, if you have any feedback or you want any additional information on what we're up to, we do services for the construction industry. Again, we do coaching services, both mental health and substance use. John has my contact, but I didn't do this for an advertisement. I did this because I care, and I just wanted to kind of get some information out to y'all. Please let me know how I can help, and thanks for the invite, guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Rich, outstanding presentation. Just one quick question that maybe is already answered. I apologize. Slides will be circulated.
Okay.
They were outstanding, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm going to send those to John, and
Yep.
and I think he can circulate them.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And if
They're
you got-
very
and-
good.
and-
Thank you.
And Rich, I just want to personally thank you on behalf of KCA.
Any consult or anything you need, reach out. I'm in.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
have-
Rich, you still there, or did I lose you? A little feedback there. I think Rich logged off. I just wanted to thank Rich and just let him know that KCA will be coming out with some resources on this topic here. And training plays a good part of that. And I'm glad Claire Stroer, I think I'm saying the last name wrong, but Claire from National Safety Council is with us as well. I told her 2 p.m. and I forgot she's in Chicago. So she showed up Central Time instead of Eastern. But National Safety Council came up with signs of impairment training, which I went through recently. And it's an awesome training. And I don't, Claire, if you want to touch on it and just talk about it a little bit, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me here, John. Yes, apologies for the miscommunications on time. I should have thought about that myself, but after Labor Day, things like that get lost. So I'm glad you guys are still hanging out for a bit so I can tell you a little bit about our training. But just so you kind of know who I am and where I'm coming from, like John said, I work with the National Safety Council, and I'm what we call a part of our impairment practice area. So we really focus on workplace safety and roadway safety. And we have a third pillar of impairment, and that's a team I work on, really trying to make sure that there's effective interventions for both workplace and roadway projects and programs that we have here at NSC. So we did create a new training, our recognition and response training for supervisors, because we saw a gap in some of the products that were available. We did an environmental scan at the beginning of 2020 to specifically investigate supervisor impairment trainings and also impairment detection technologies, which I'm not going to talk about the technology piece today. That's a conversation for another time. But really just to see what was out there and if they were evidence-based and how they were talking about impairment, and gathered a group of experts to figure out where we could take more action to provide more resources for employers specifically. And as a result of that research that we did, we decided that we really wanted to create a new training. It's essentially a reasonable suspicion training, but the reason that we wanted to create a new training is because we've been changing the narrative a little bit about impairment and what does that mean for workplace safety. So a part of that training is really talking about this broader scope of how we're addressing impairment at work. So not just substance related issues like you see in a lot of reasonable suspicion trainings. We talk about things like fatigue and mental distress, and even things like extreme temperatures and how that can impact workers. I mean, how you can really look at all of those issues and how supervisors can connect with those that they're working with to help connect them to care if that's something that they're needing, and also to have that dialogue to better address these issues and have the confidence to respond. So that's the training that we've created. Just so you know a little bit about what that training looks like. It's an hour-long e-learning that we have. And really the goal is to help supervisors both recognize impairment, so looking at those signs and symptoms, but also respond to impairment. So we created an original 6 steps to really provide a more tangible and specific process for supervisors and also other kinds of workplace professionals like EHS folks, and also safety professionals and HR professionals as well, to go through that process and do a lot of skill building and scenarios in different industries to really hammer that piece in. So it's our starting point. It's something that we're going to grow on. It's not DOT compliant yet. So, and we're going to continue to evaluate it, since that's something we saw in our research was lacking as well, to make sure that we're actually seeing behavior change when we release these new tools for employers to use. So we're going to continue to build on the program, but this is the first start, and we're really excited about it. We launched it in October of last year, so it's been around for a little bit, but I'm happy to answer more specific questions. I know there's not a lot of time to go into the details about the training, but if you're curious about, the specific lessons and, what those scenarios look like or anything like that, or even our content that we have at NSC about impairment, I'm happy to go through some of that information with you. Does that cover what you wanted me to talk about, John? I know
Yeah.
it was a pretty brief
Yeah.
overview, but that was the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to get the link out so people know where to go for the training. And I found it extremely helpful in that I could see contractors using the forms that you come up with whenever you respond and you document, what happens for the betterment of the worker to get the help that they need and to properly address everything. But yeah, the handouts that go along with the training were awesome.
Great. I'm glad you found some value in those, and certainly in the training. We really took a focus on safety, obviously with NSC, so that's our big thing, instead of also taking a punitive approach, really emphasizing the well-being concerns of employees and how that all fits into safety and well-being together. So happy to share those forms out or those resources to anybody who's interested.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thanks for the information. And any other questions or comments from anyone? There's Claire's email. She just put in the chat. And afterwards, like Rich said, he'll send me the slides. I'll put them up, and as well as a recording of this whole session will be up on the KCA YouTube page, and we'll get it out to everyone. Thank you for your time, and hope you have a great week. Great. Mike, you got something before we go?
No, I'm standing by, everybody. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
You know what? Hey, John,
Yeah.